Look there, brothers!
Chapter 1. A Journey Wrapped in Legend. Have you ever sat alone in your bed at night, staring blankly at the ceiling? If you have, you know it's a great time for all sorts of thoughts to go sailing through your mind. And now and again, one of those thoughts might just be, who am I? Where did I come from? And where am I going? And then you remember that there are billions of other people out there on this planet who are also lying in their beds asking exactly the same questions. And suddenly you feel a little less alone. You think about your ancestors, maybe back a couple of generations, and you wonder where they came from and what their lives were like. You imagine the long sea journeys they must have endured, crossing huge stretches of water in tiny boats, not knowing what lay ahead. You wonder what it must have been like for them when they finally reached land after weeks or even months at sea. And you think about how their experiences shaped the world you live in today. Well, tonight I want to tell you the story of a man who set sail across the ocean more than 1,500 years ago. His name was Brendan the Navigator. He left Ireland with a small group of monks and sailed west. They traveled for weeks over a vast stretch of water until they finally sighted land. But when they arrived, they found no one there. The island was uninhabited. This is his story. A while back, I posted an episode about the voyages of Saint Brendan the Navigator, which is one of the most popular episodes I've ever done. So many of you wrote in the comments that you wanted to hear more about him, and since he's someone I'm very interested in, too, I thought I would delve deeper into the legend of Brendan the Navigator and see if there is anything we can learn from it. In Chapter 1 of this series, I'll explore how Brendan became famous and ask whether he really did voyage to America before Christopher Columbus. Let me start by setting the tone for this series. It's late at night. You're in bed, and I'm here to help you drift off to sleep. Well, maybe not right away, but soon. We'll travel back in time to the 6th century and meet an old monk named Brendan. He's sitting in his cell, writing down stories of voyages made by saints and monks before him. As he writes, he thinks about the amazing adventures they had and wonders if he should write about them. After all, he is only a simple monk, and perhaps these stories will be too much for his fellow brothers in the monastery to believe. But he knows that they need something to inspire them, so he takes up his quill and begins to write. Brendan writes about a man named Kieran, who traveled from Ireland to the distant lands of Brittany. He also writes about two holy men who went fishing in the sea, and after rowing for 3 weeks, came upon a strange island full of wondrous beasts. But the story that Brendan wants to write about the most is the tale of Brendan, a man from a noble family in Ireland who decided to leave everything behind and go on a pilgrimage to the monastery at Clonmacnoise. On the way, he met some sailors who invited him to join them on their voyage to the land of the Western Isles, which was said to be inhabited by giants. Brendan accepted the invitation and spent a year traveling the seas with these sailors. During their journey, they encountered many dangers, including storms, shipwrecks, and attacks from sea monsters. But Brendan never lost faith, and each time they faced a challenge, they prayed to God for help and were saved. But Brendan knew that their journey was coming to an end, and he did not want to return to his old life. So, as they approached the shore, he told the sailors that he was leaving. The sailors were sad to see him go, but they wished him luck on his travels. And so, Brendan started his journey home. But he soon realized that he didn't want to go back to his old life. Instead, he decided to continue traveling and see where the road would take him. And so he walked along the coast until he came across a beautiful sandy beach. There he built himself a small hut and settled down to live the life of a hermit. As time passed, other people began to hear about Brendan's wisdom and holiness, and they started visiting him for advice and comfort. Soon, Brendan had become a local saint, and he continued to live a simple life on his beach until one day when he was called to visit a neighboring king who was sick. Brendan did his best to help the king, but the monarch was beyond saving, and he died shortly after Brendan's visit. However, unbeknownst to Brendan, the king's advisors were plotting against him. Believing that Brendan had poisoned the king in order to take the throne for himself, they arrested Brendan and threw him into prison, where they planned to keep him until he confessed to his crimes. But Brendan never wavered in his innocence, and after several months in jail, he was released without charge. Now, Brendan could have easily retreated back to his hermitage and lived out the rest of his days in peace. But he couldn't bear the thought of people believing he was a murderer. And so, he set out on a new journey. He sailed across the sea to a faraway land, and there he founded a new monastery. He lived out the remainder of his days there, free from the accusations that had haunted him for so long. And it's said that he spent his final years writing down the stories of all the amazing voyages that had taken place before him. And that's the story Brendan, the Navigator, wrote about himself. But there's another story about him, too. One that he never wrote down, but was written about him by someone else. And this is the story I want to focus on in this series. But first, I need to explain why we even know about these stories. The Irish preserved their folklore in an incredibly unique way. While other cultures typically relied on written records or oral traditions, the Irish used a technique known as the art of memory, or mnemonics. Mnemonics is a system of memorizing and preserving information by associating it with a visual image. This allowed the Irish to memorize and recite long passages of text, such as stories of heroes and saints, for their entertainment and education. The art of memory flourished in Ireland during the early Middle Ages and played an important role in preserving Irish culture and history. Some scholars believe that the Irish monks may have developed this technique independently, while others suggest it may have been influenced by Greek and Roman traditions. Regardless of its origins, mnemonics became an integral part of Irish culture and helped preserve the country's rich history and traditions for future generations. Mnemonics allowed the Irish to share stories orally for centuries without fear of forgetting them. The stories were not written down until later, usually by monks who would recite them from memory. In the case of Brendan the Navigator, we don't know who wrote the story about him. It was likely written by an Irish monk somewhere in the 8th or 9th century, and it starts like this. The man who is called Brendan was the son of a powerful chieftain named Finian. When Brendan was still young, he experienced a profound change of heart and gave up his worldly possessions to become a monk. He dedicated his life to serving the Lord and embarked on a spiritual journey that took him across the sea to distant lands. With a small band of followers, Brendan ventured forth, driven by his unshakable faith and the desire to spread the word of God. But their journey was far from easy. They faced treacherous waters and encountered terrifying creatures that tried to hinder their progress. Despite the challenges they faced, Brendan and his companions pressed on, guided by their unwavering belief in God's plan for them. They explored uncharted waters and discovered new lands, all while spreading the message of Christianity and making converts along the way. Their adventures took them to places that had never before been seen by human eyes. And they returned to Ireland with tales of wonder and excitement that inspired others to follow in their footsteps. So was Brendan, the Navigator, really the first European to reach the Americas? Well, that's impossible to say for sure. The answer lies somewhere beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, lost to the sands of time. But one thing is certain: Brendan's legacy lives on in the stories that have been passed down through the ages. His courage, faith, and sense of adventure continue to inspire us today. This is the first chapter in our journey through the legend of Brendan the Navigator. Now, it's time for you to close your eyes. Let your mind wander and sail slowly through the mists of time. Allow yourself to get lost in the world of Brendan and his incredible adventures. Imagine yourself on his ship as he braves the stormy seas and encounters strange and wonderful creatures. Feel the wind in your hair and the spray of the ocean on your face as you journey alongside him to discover new lands and make new friends. It's important to take time to explore your own personal history and the stories that have shaped your identity. Brendan's journey is a reminder of the importance of pursuing our dreams and exploring the unknown with courage and determination. Who knows what adventures await you in the chapters ahead? Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to hit subscribe. I'll be back next week with Chapter 2. Until then, keep exploring and dreaming big. Thanks for listening. Chapter 2. Ireland in the 6th century. The world of St. Brendan. Imagine with me for a moment that it's the year 550 AD. You are standing on a wind-swept Irish shore, watching a frail curragh, a traditional Irish boat, battle the waves of the wild Atlantic. On board is one man, a solitary monk, who has just put to sea on a journey into the unknown. He has turned his back on the familiar land of saints and scholars, leaving behind him the flickering candlelight of monasteries where monks devoted their lives to God through prayer, study, and hard manual labor. Now he is alone on the heaving sea, cut off from the sound of human voices, surrounded by nothing but the cry of gulls and the rhythm of the relentless waves. Is this man mad? What is he seeking out there in the endless expanse of the ocean? And what does this quest tell us about the world he is leaving behind? Welcome to Grounded History. Today, we re-go in to explore the world of early medieval Ireland and find out what life was like in the 6th century when St. Brendan set sail on his incredible voyage of discovery. Our story begins in a different time and a different place, a time when the Roman legions were sweeping across Europe, subduing all before them. But while the eagle standard of Rome was a symbol of power and oppression to many, there were others who saw in it an opportunity. Among these were some of the Druids, the Celtic priests who had long held sway over the Irish people. As the legions approached, they fled to the remote Western Isles of Ireland, where they preserved their ancient traditions in secret. There, they waited patiently for the right moment to strike back at their oppressors. When the legions finally withdrew, it wasn't long before the Druids took their revenge, killing every last Roman soldier on the island. This victory, however, proved to be short-lived, for the Druids soon turned on each other, descending into a bitter civil war that would decide the fate of Ireland forever. In the end, it was the followers of a new faith, Christianity, who emerged victorious. With the support of the local kings, the Christian missionaries quickly set about the task of converting the Irish to their new faith. They built churches and monasteries, trained new clergy, and translated the scriptures into Gaelic. Within a century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in Ireland, but the old ways did not die easily. In fact, they survived for centuries, often coexisting with Christianity and influencing its development. For example, many of the early Christian saints were known to have studied with the Druids, learning their secrets and incorporating them into their own beliefs. One of the most famous of these was Saint Patrick, who is said to have freed Ireland from the tyranny of the Druids. According to legend, Patrick was captured by a Druid and condemned to death, but he escaped and went on to become the patron saint of Ireland. The conversion of Ireland was a slow process that took several centuries to complete. Some of the native population resisted the new faith, but most of the Irish eventually became Christian. The early Christians in Ireland were mostly poor and uneducated, but they were very zealous in their faith. They saw Christianity as a way to escape the violence and chaos of the pagan world, and they were willing to make great sacrifices to live according to their new religion. The Irish monks were particularly zealous, and they soon became known throughout Europe for their piety and scholarship. They founded monasteries all over Ireland, and these monasteries quickly became centers of learning and culture. The monks copied manuscripts by hand, and they also wrote original works on a variety of topics. They were also very active in missionary work, and they spread Christianity to many parts of Europe. In addition to their religious duties, the monks also engaged in a variety of crafts, such as metalwork, woodworking, and farming. They were self-sufficient, and they did not rely on donations from outsiders. They also welcomed travelers and pilgrims to their monasteries, and they provided them with food and lodging. The monasteries were also important centers of hospitality, and they played an important role in the social and cultural life of the Irish people. But what about those who didn't live in monasteries? What was life like for ordinary people in 6th century Ireland? Life in 6th century Ireland was difficult. The Irish people were poor, and they lived in a state of constant warfare with the Britons, the Scots, and the Vikings. They also had to contend with the harsh climate, which made farming a risky proposition. Despite these hardships, the Irish people were resilient, and they developed a strong sense of community. They lived in small villages, and they relied on each other for help. They also had a rich culture, and they had a strong tradition of storytelling and music. The Irish people were animistic, and they believed that the natural world was full of spirits. They also had a strong belief in the afterlife, and they believed that the souls of the dead could come back to earth to visit the living. The Irish people were also very superstitious, and they believed in a variety of magical creatures, such as fairies, goblins, and trolls. Now, let's return to our monk on the Curragh, battling his way across the Irish Sea. Why is he doing this? What is he hoping to find out there in the vast emptiness of the ocean. This practice was called white martyrdom, after the color of the sea and the foam of the waves. It was considered a form of penance, a way to test one's faith and commitment to God. The monks who did this were known as anchorites or hermits, and they were highly respected in their communities. They were usually older monks who had already achieved a high level of holiness. They were also usually well educated, and they were familiar with the scriptures. The monks would typically spend several weeks at sea, subsisting on a diet of bread and water. They would pray constantly, and they would try to avoid contact with other humans. They believed that by doing this, they were purifying themselves and preparing themselves for a more intense spiritual experience. Some monks even claimed to have seen visions or experienced other supernatural phenomena while at sea. When the monks finally returned to land, they were usually greeted as heroes. They were given a hero's welcome, and they were often interviewed about their experiences. Their stories were then written down and circulated throughout the monastic community. So why do you think these monks did this? What do you think they hoped to find out there in the endless sea? Perhaps they were seeking solitude and peace. Maybe they wanted to escape the distractions of everyday life. Or maybe they were simply trying to deepen their relationship with God. Whatever their motivations, these monks were clearly very dedicated to their faith. They were willing to endure great hardship and isolation in order to spend more time with God. They were also very brave. Facing the dangers of the open sea was not for the faint of heart. But these monks were not afraid. They knew that they were in good company. They were following in the footsteps of Christ himself, who had walked on the water to reach his disciples in the midst of a storm. Ireland in the 6th century was a land of contrasts. It was a place where the old ways and the new faith coexisted, where the light of learning shone brightly in the darkness of ignorance, and where the courage of the monks was tested in the white martyrdom of the sea. It was a rough and dangerous world, but it was also a world full of beauty and wonder. The Irish people had a deep connection to the natural world, and they saw the beauty of Ireland as a reflection of the beauty of God's creation. They also had a rich culture that celebrated the beauty of their land and the wonder of their faith. I hope you enjoyed your journey back to the 6th century. If you want to learn more about this fascinating period of history, I encourage you to do some research. You can also check out some of my other videos on early medieval Ireland. Thanks for watching. Bye. In the previous episode, we followed Brendan from his birth until he became the abbot of a monastery at the age of 25. That was quite some time ago now, and a lot has happened since then, but it's time to continue his story. This is Chapter 3 of the series, The Life of Saint Brendan, Monk, Abbot, and Seafarer. Our story begins with Brendan, who is now a well-known abbot of a monastery. He had already established his reputation as a holy man through miracles and wisdom. One day, however, while he was praying in his usual spot by the sea, he hears God speaking to him. God asks Brendan if he really believes that he can do great things for him. When Brendan replies, yes, God tells him to set out on a pilgrimage over the sea and not to return until he has found the place he has been sent to. God also promises to be with him during this journey. At first, Brendan feels quite confident. However, when he thinks about how far away other countries are, even by boat, and that he has never traveled so far before, he starts feeling afraid and hesitates. He asks for another sign, but God reminds him that he had already given him one. Brendan then accepts his mission and sets out to sea. In his boat were 3 other people who would help him, Sanan or Sananis, meaning little seal. This name must have been given to him because of something special about him. Perhaps he resembled a seal in some way. Then there was another man named Lugan, whose name means little hollow or little gray. Finally, there was a scribe named Bladden, who wrote down everything that happened to them during their journey. After sailing for 3 weeks, they finally reached land. Here, a king and queen had been expecting their arrival, and they welcomed Brendan and his companions with open arms, giving them food and drink. They also told them that a church had already been built where they landed, and they invited the monks to come and see it. It turned out that the church they visited was actually identical to the church that Brendan had left behind. So after spending a short time there, they decided to return home. On the way back, they stopped at a nearby island where Brendan met a hermit who had been living there for 7 years. Brendan allowed the hermit to join him, and the 4 of them continued on their journey. When they arrived back at their own church, Brendan felt very happy to be home again. But then, suddenly, he felt a strong urge to go back to the island they had just visited. And even though he didn't understand why, he decided to follow his instincts. When they returned, they found that the church they had seen before was gone, and there was no trace of it to be found anywhere around. Disappointed, they turned back again and headed for the next island. Once they reached the shore, Brendan saw a group of men carrying a cross to the top of a hill. He asked what it meant, and they told him that they were going to crucify someone on it. Brendan, who had a deep hatred for injustice, ran towards the hill to stop them. But when he got closer, he realized that the man being crucified was Jesus Christ himself. Shocked and overwhelmed, Brendan fell to his knees in front of Jesus and begged for mercy. Jesus responded by healing him and telling him to go home. On the way back to his boat, Brendan stopped to pick up a stone from the ground, which would later become known as the Stone of Miracles. As many sick people were healed by simply touching it. Brendan and his companions then sailed on to the next island, where they stayed for a few days. While there, Brendan had a vision of an angel who showed him a church on a distant island and told him to build a monastery there. After making preparations, Brendan and his followers set off to find this new island. The journey was long and tiring, and they had to endure many storms along the way. Eventually, however, they finally sighted land and went ashore to explore. They soon discovered that it was exactly like the angel had described, and they began building the monastery immediately. Life at the monastery was peaceful and serene, and everything seemed to be going well. However, after about 16 months, two monks, Senan and Lugan, wished to return home. Brendan, who loved both of them very much, knew that he couldn't keep them against their will. So he gave them permission to leave, and they all prayed together before saying goodbye. Once they were gone, Brendan's nephew, who had joined him on the journey, also decided to return home. Again, Brendan understood and respected his decision and saw him off with sadness. Brendan and his remaining companions continued on their journey until they reached another island where they had a wonderful time. There, they met many interesting people and explored different places. One day, however, they heard about a nearby island that had beautiful women who were said to be the best in the world. Brendan, who was a monk and not allowed to desire women, was curious to see if it was true and decided to go there. But when he arrived, he found that the women were indeed so beautiful that even his strongest desires could not compare to them. Brendan, who knew he shouldn't look at them, quickly looked away. However, the women noticed him and called out to him, asking why he was there. Brendan, who didn't want to stay any longer, lied and said he had been shipwrecked. The women believed him and offered to help him by providing him with food and drink. But Brendan politely refused, explaining that he needed to get back to his ship. The women, who were disappointed that he didn't want to stay, asked if there was anything they could do for him before he left. And Brendan told them he would like to have one of the finest shirts that one of them had on. Impressed by his honesty, the women gave him the most beautiful shirt they had. And when Brendan saw it, he was shocked by its magnificence. Brendan thanked them for their generosity and promised to remember them in his prayers. He then went back to his ship, feeling grateful for their kindness. The next day, Brendan and his companions set sail again and reached a new island. This time, they were greeted by an old man who had been living there alone for many years. He told them about his life and how he had spent the last 19 years carving crosses out of wood. Moved by his dedication, Brendan asked him to come live in their monastery instead, and the old man happily accepted. They then continued their journey and settled on a new island where they lived for 6 years. During this time, Brendan's reputation grew, and many people came to him for help and guidance. One day, Brendan received a letter from his monastery asking him to return as they were having problems without him. Realizing that it was time to go, Brendan gathered his companions and prepared for the journey home. As they sailed away, the old man who had carved crosses for 19 years stood on the shore waving goodbye. Despite being happy to return home, Brendan felt sad to leave the old man behind. Upon returning to Ireland, Brendan found that his monastery was indeed in trouble, and the surrounding area had also suffered greatly. Determined to help, he performed various miracles to heal the sick and restore the land. Over time, he was able to bring peace and prosperity back to the region. But Brendan still thought about the island where the old man lived, and he often wondered how he was doing. One night, Brendan had a dream in which the old man appeared and told him that he had passed away. Although Brendan felt sad to hear this, he was also glad that the old man was no longer suffering. Brendan continued to live out the remainder of his days, helping others and spreading the word of God. He became known as a great leader, and many people followed his teachings. And so, that brings us to the end of chapter 3. Now, if you've been enjoying these videos and would like to support them, please consider becoming a patron, where you can watch each episode completely ad-free 1 week early. You can also support the channel by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment below with your thoughts, suggestions, and feedback. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye. It is time to begin our story. So far, we've spoken of Brendan, the navigator, and the marvelous lands he found. But we have yet spoken of how he built his fleet, or how he prepared himself for the long voyage. And so, this is chapter 4, Preparing for the Voyage. We'll start with the construction of the curragh, because without a boat, there can be no voyage. Now, if you've ever seen pictures of these amazing boats, then you know they are magnificent. But don't let those pictures fool you. This was not an easy boat to build. It was made from oak trees, which were very difficult to fell. They had to be cut in sections, brought to the shore, and then carefully dried out. Then came the shaping of the planks, which Brendan and his men did with an axe. Then the planks were sewn together with a special type of cord made from the flax plant. The bottom was filled with oakum, which is a kind of tarred hemp, and the whole thing was coated with leather, both inside and out. Finally, the mast and the sail were added, and the boat was complete. A skilled crew could make one of these boats in about a month, and it would last for generations if properly cared for. But building a boat isn't enough. You also need companions for your journey, especially when you're going into the unknown. Who were these companions? According to the early sources, there were 20 of them, However, the later versions say there were only 7. We'll go with 7. Since the later version is more detailed and probably more accurate. And who were these 7 men? Well, let's just say they were Brendan's best friends. The people he trusted the most, the ones he had worked with for years, sharing the hardships and the joys of monastic life. These men were all volunteers. No one forced them to join Brendan, no doubt that much. And their names were Barvin, with whom Brendan shared the leadership of the expedition. Chungal, Finn, Dubthok, Man, Eoshid, and Senang, like Brendan. Each of these men had already been around the world a bit, sailing to places like France and even North Africa. Together, they knew all the skills necessary to keep alive on the open sea. One of the things they had to do to prepare for the voyage was to pray a lot. Now, you might think that's easy. Just close your eyes and say a few Hail Marys, but they didn't do that. Oh no, they prayed for 3 full weeks before setting sail. Every day they got up at the usual time and said the prayers and recited the Psalms. At noon, they prayed for safe passage across the sea. At evening, they prayed for protection from storms and monsters. Even in the middle of the night, they could be heard reciting prayers under their breath. They did this so that even their subconscious mind would be focused on God. In other words, they wanted to make sure every part of themselves was ready to face whatever lay ahead. When they finally felt they had prayed enough, they went to the High King and asked for his blessing. He gave it, but he wasn't much help otherwise. All he did was hand them a cross made of wood and tell them to keep it with them always. Then it was time to get on with the voyage. And how did they set out to sea? We can reconstruct their probable route by looking at the text and matching the descriptions with what we know of geography and sailing. They started from a harbor called Inver Colpa, which is now known as the River Colp in County Cork. From there, they sailed directly west. Within 2 days, they reached the Land of Women, where all the inhabitants were women, except for one man who acted as their leader. This place is thought to be either the Blasket Islands or Skellig Michael. After staying there for a few days, presumably getting supplies, they headed further west again. This time to the Fortunate Isles, which is believed to be the Azores. They stayed here for a week, then set sail for the New World. Their first stop was a land which they called Inis Katha, which is believed to be either Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. Here they stayed for 3 days, then set sail for their final destination, which was the island of Briannia. Let's take a moment to really think about what these men did. They left the relative safety of the known world and ventured into the vast ocean. Guided only by the stars and their own intuition. They faced storms, monster waves, and creatures that had never been seen before. And they did all this without complaining. These men were truly brave, and their courage should inspire us to face whatever challenges we may encounter in our own lives. We should also remember that these men were not just brave, but also humble. They knew that they were not in control of the situation. There were forces at work that were far greater than they were. And so they turned to God for help. They knew that without His blessing, they would not have made it. As we continue our story, we should keep these lessons in mind. We will see great courage and humility, but we will also see moments when the men forget what they have learned. Let us hope that their example will guide us and that we will be able to follow in their footsteps. The first thing that catches our attention in this chapter is the importance of preparation. Our modern culture often emphasizes spontaneity and living in the moment. But the story of Brendan and his crew reminds us that preparation is also important. They did not just set sail for the unknown. They spent weeks praying and preparing themselves mentally and spiritually for the journey. They knew that facing the challenges that lay ahead would require a strong mind and a deep faith. We can learn from their example and remember that preparation is not just for physical journeys, but also for the challenges and changes that life throws our way. Another important lesson from this chapter is the value of companionship. Brendan did not choose to go alone on this journey. He assembled a crew of 7 men whom he trusted and who shared his vision. The importance of friendship and community is a recurring theme in the story. Throughout their journey, the crew faces many challenges, but they overcome them by working together and supporting each other. We can learn from them the importance of choosing our companions wisely and the strength that comes from working together towards a common goal. Finally, this chapter teaches us about bravery. The crew of Brendan's ship ventures into the unknown, leaving behind the familiar shores of their homeland. They face the dangers of the open sea and the uncertainty of what lies ahead with courage and determination. We can learn from their example that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The story reminds us that we all have the capacity for bravery within us, and that we can face our fears and uncertainties with courage if we are willing to do so. In conclusion, Chapter 4 of Brendan's Voyage is a powerful reminder of the importance of preparation, companionship, and bravery. As we continue on this journey, let us remember these lessons and strive to apply them to our own lives. May we be prepared for the challenges that lie ahead. May we cherish our friendships, and may we find the courage to face our fears with bravery. Until next time, thanks for watching. Brendan left the familiar shores of Ireland's west coast with only the faintest of clues about where he was going. His ship, guided by invisible currents, was sailing into unknown waters, deeper and more mysterious than any ocean Brendan had ever known. The men with him were becoming increasingly uneasy. They had sailed the seas before, but this voyage was different. This was a journey to the edge of the world, an expedition into the very jaws of hell itself. The first sign that something was amiss came when they spotted an island in the distance. It looked like any other landmass at first, just another speck of rock and dirt in the endless expanse of water. But as they drew closer, its true nature became apparent. The island was covered in what appeared to be scales, like some colossal fish monster lying in wait. And then there were the birds, screeching and flapping their wings so loudly that it sounded like the screams of tormented souls. It was an ominous start to their journey. But the crew were seasoned sailors, and seasoned sailors do not turn back from a storm or a screaming bird. They dropped anchor and set foot on the island, though even the strongest among them trembled with fear as they did. As soon as they stepped off the boat, the ground split open and spewed forth boiling hot water, creating a scene straight out of hell itself. The stench of rotten eggs filled the air, and the men could have sworn they heard the voice of Satan himself cackling at their misfortune. Unsurprisingly, no one wanted to stay there longer than they had to. They climbed back aboard the ship and fled the island as quickly as they could. This was no ordinary place. Brendan realized with growing certainty that this was no mere island, but a living creature of some kind. In fact, he believed it to be a whale of monstrous proportions, so large that it had been mistaken for an island. Brendan didn't know why the whale had spoken to him, but he felt as though it was a warning of sorts, a message from God that their journey would not be easy. He shared his concerns with his crew, but they only laughed in his face. These men were all older than Brendan, and they had seen enough of the world to not let a talking whale get to them. Still, Brendan couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Something about this voyage didn't feel right. As the days turned into weeks, the crew began to see strange and wonderful things. They encountered animals unlike any they had ever seen before, including one creature that resembled a horse, but with the head of a lion. They also saw fish that flew through the air, birds that lived underwater, and forests that grew out of thin air. All around them, the laws of nature seemed to be bending and breaking. They were in a world turned upside down, a realm of fantasy where anything was possible. Now, those that had scoffed at Brendan's fears now started to become unnerved. Could this be the edge of the world, the fabled land beyond the Western Ocean? Or had they perhaps stumbled into hell itself? Some of the men were losing their minds, but Brendan kept his cool. He knew that if he panicked, the others would follow his lead and descend into chaos. So he played the role of the brave leader, even though inside he was filled with dread. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent into the ocean, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, the men saw something that made them gasp in awe and terror. Out of the corner of his eye, Brendan saw a shape rising out of the water, dark and hulking against the fiery sky. At first he thought it was a monstrous fish, but as it drew closer, he realized it was something far more terrifying. It was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen before, with the body of a fish and the head of a man. Its eyes were large and luminous, staring directly at them with an intelligence that sent shivers down their spines. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished beneath the waves, leaving the men to wonder if what they had seen was real or a figment of their exhausted imaginations. But as the darkness deepened and the stars began to twinkle above them, the men knew that they were not alone. They could feel the presence of unseen eyes watching them, and the sound of whispers carried on the wind. They huddled together on the ship, trying to find comfort in numbers, but their efforts were in vain. And then, as if summoned by their fear, the creature emerged again. It rose out of the water, its fishtail thrashing back and forth, and let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the ship. Panic seized the men. They screamed and ran around the deck, their prayers carried away on the wind. But Brendan stood firm. He gripped the mast of the ship, his knuckles white, and stared back at the creature. He had no weapons, but he had something far more powerful: his faith. In that moment of crisis, Brendan remembered the words of the old hermit. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, asking for guidance and strength. And when he opened them again, he saw that the creature was gone. The men on the ship were still trembling, but Brendan knew that they had been spared. He had faced the monster and won. Of course, the men asked him how he had done it, but Brendan only smiled mysteriously and said nothing. In truth, he didn't know how he had survived, but he was grateful nonetheless. He knew that the creature had not meant him harm, but it was a test of his faith, a trial by fire that he had been chosen to endure. As the days passed, the weather took a turn for the worse. Storms raged, waves crashed, and the men on board the ship struggled to keep it on course. Brendan, however, remained calm. He knew that this, too, was part of the test. He had already faced the monster of the sea, and he was ready for whatever else fate had in store for him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the storms subsided and the sun began to shine once again. Brendan and his crew emerged from the wreckage of their ship, battered but alive. They had survived the wrath of the sea and emerged on the other side, forever changed by their experience. As they made their way ashore, Brendan couldn't help but look back at the sea that had tested them so mightily. He knew that he would never forget what he had seen and experienced there. The rolling waves, the talking whale, the fish with human heads, and the eerie, almost mythical atmosphere of the place. It was a world like no other, a hidden realm that lay just beyond the edge of the known world. And as he walked away, he could have sworn he heard the voice of the old hermit calling out to him. "Welcome to the edge of the world," it said. "What you have seen here will stay with you forever. Now, and may God be with you." With that, the vision faded, and Brendan found himself back on the shores of Ireland. He looked out over the familiar landscape and felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had returned home, but he knew that he was not the same man who had left. He had journeyed to the edge of the world and stared into the abyss, and it had changed him in ways he could never have imagined. And so, dear listener, if you ever find yourself sailing on the Western Ocean, keep a sharp lookout for a talking whale or a fish with a human head. And if you hear the voice of an old hermit calling out to you, heed his words and turn back. For the place you seek is not for the living, but for those who have lost their way and need to find their way back home. I hope you enjoyed this chapter of Brendan's journey to the mysterious lands beyond the Western Ocean. If you like these stories, please hit the like button and subscribe for more adventures. Now close your eyes, drift off to sleep, and may your dreams take you to magical lands beyond the edge of the world. Until next time, farewell. Chapter 6: Wonders of the Sea, Islands, Creatures, and Mysteries. Welcome to the voyage of Saint Brendan, also known as Navigator. This is Chapter 6. Now, our hero Brendan has sailed west out of Ireland, with his crew in search of adventure and the mythical land of the Blessed Isles, or the Isle of the Blessed. Now, some scholars believe that he was actually a real historical person who set sail sometime around the 6th century, while others believe he's entirely a mythical figure whose journey is entirely symbolic. Regardless, let's jump right into the story. And here we go with the first part of Chapter 6. And after sailing for many days over the ocean wave, they came upon an island and landed there to rest. And they found there the greatest multitude of sheep they had ever seen, and not one wolf or dog or any other kind of wild beast. There were also no trees on the island, nor any grass, but it was full of soft grass and shrubs. So the men feasted on the grass till their hunger was appeased, and they sailed away again. This episode is called The Island of Sheep. It may be symbolic, representing Jesus Christ, the Good Shepherd, and his flock. Or it could be a real place that Brendan and his crew actually visited. Now, continuing our tale, after sailing for 7 days, they spied another island and made for it. When they got closer, they heard the sweetest singing, like that of angels, and went ashore to see what it was. Then they found birds singing divine hymns in praise of God. So Brendan and his men stayed there, listening to the heavenly song for 3 hours, and then they sailed away again. Some scholars think that this episode of the birds singing is an allegory meant to symbolize the heavenly Jerusalem spoken of in the book of Revelation, while others believe that Brendan and his men may have actually stumbled upon a colony of birds that sang these strange songs. Now, moving forward in our story, after sailing for about 40 days, they spied what looked to them like an island in the middle of the sea. So they made for it and found it was a whale. For it was a monstrous whale which had come up out of the depths of the sea and was lying there on the surface of the water. So the men landed on its back and feasted on its flesh, and then they sailed away again. This episode is called Jasconius, which is Latin for socon. The whale, in fact, soaks up the sun on the surface of the water. Now, when a whale does this, we call it breaching. Whales breach all the time, jumping out of the water and soaking themselves in the sun. They must have been huge. It says in the Bible that Jonah was swallowed by a great fish, and after 3 days he came out on dry land. So perhaps Jonah and this whale were one and the same. Either way, Brendan and his men were saved from starvation thanks to the whale. And they named it Yaskin, or Jasconius, which means soaken. So those are the 3 parts of chapter 6. An island full of sheep, an island full of singing birds, and a soaken whale. But wait, there's more. Let me tell you about the 3 possible interpretations of this chapter, as well as Brendan's travels in general. The first interpretation is that Brendan and his crew actually traveled to all these far-off lands, including the mysterious and magical Isle of the Blessed. In support of this theory, we can point to the fact that the Irish monk Abbot wrote a life of Saint Brendan that supports the authenticity of the voyage. However, Abbot wrote this about 200 years after Brendan supposedly sailed. So there may have been some embellishments added over time. Additionally, even though Europe at the time was familiar with the existence of Iceland, it was not familiar with the existence of the Americas. Yet this tale says that Brendan and his crew sailed to the New World, which would mean that they preceded Christopher Columbus by almost 500 years. Many scholars find this hard to believe because, given the technology available at the time, such a journey would have been almost impossible. The second interpretation is that Brendan and his crew only traveled part of the way, maybe just beyond the coast of Ireland, or maybe they did circle some islands in the North Atlantic, like the Azores or the British Isles, or maybe they did reach Iceland, but they didn't actually make it to the Americas. This is a more widely accepted theory among scholars today, simply because it's more plausible. Given the technology available at the time, it would have been much easier for them to get lost in the North Atlantic and wind up somewhere else. Or maybe some of these islands and lands really did exist, like the island of sheep, the island of singing birds, and the Soken whale. Maybe Brendan and his crew did actually see some of these amazing things. Who knows? The third interpretation is that this whole story is symbolic and not meant to be taken literally. According to this view, the entire journey is symbolic of the spiritual journey of the soul toward God. The various lands, creatures, and people that Brendan meets on his journey represent different virtues, vices, temptations, and states of being that the soul encounters on its way toward God. In this view, the story serves as an allegory to teach Christian values and encourage the faithful to live a holy life. Now, if you think the story of Brendan and his voyages sounds crazy, you might be interested to know that there are people today who are trying to follow in his footsteps. There's an organization called the Brendan Voyage, and they try to recreate Brendan's journey every few years. They take off from Ireland and try to find these mysterious lands. Now, granted, they have modern conveniences like GPS and modern boats, but still, imagine trying to navigate the ocean without a compass. That would be pretty tough. Now, speaking of the Brendan Voyage, I actually have a personal connection to this story. You see, I lived in Ireland for 6 months in 2007, and I was living there with my then girlfriend, who was from County Kerry, not too far from where Saint Brendan is said to have lived. At the time, I knew nothing about his story. But one day, her father told me that a group of friends of his were going to set sail and try to follow in Brendan's footsteps. So, I got to meet some of these brave adventurers, and it was very cool to see how excited they were about following in Brendan's footsteps. Now, unfortunately, the weather was bad that year, and they were unable to get too far past the coast of Ireland. But still, it was very cool to hear about their adventure. And now that I know the story of Brendan, I can appreciate how difficult it must have been for them to set sail without a map or a compass. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Voyage of Saint Brendan. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm the host. And until next time, may your sails be full and your spirits higher. Welcome to my channel. This is Chapter 7 of the modern retelling of the classic tale, The Voyage of Saint Brendan. The last we saw of our hero, he had set sail from Ireland, with 14 companions in search of the legendary land of the Blessed Isles, where time flowed backwards and the joys of youth were restored to old men. But Brendan soon found that the sea was not as kind to his aging bones as he'd hoped. Let us now continue the story. Storms tossed the frail boat like a leaf in the current. Waves crashed over the deck, stealing Brendan's cloak and whipping his beard and hair until his face was raw with salt. His companions clung to the mast, too afraid to move as the wind screamed through the rigging. Lightning split the sky, revealing the angry faces of gods long forgotten by the people of Ireland. Brendan alone stood firm, securing loose ropes, embracing the mast, while the others prayed silently to God for deliverance. Their voyage had been beset by bad weather since they left the familiar shores of Ireland. Could this be a sign that the journey was doomed before they even reached the edge of the known world? After what felt like an eternity, the storm began to ease. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, it revealed a sight that made the men gasp. Before them lay an island, or at least what remained of one. Jagged cliffs rose up from the churning water, like the broken ribs of some colossal beast. Not a tree nor shrubbery marred the rock, only the ghosts of birds wheeling overhead. As the men rowed ashore, their hearts sank. This desolate place felt tainted by the very presence of the sea, a tangible manifestation of the chaos that had brought them here. Yet they had no choice but to stay. There was no shelter on this God-forsaken rock, and the sea was too rough for them to attempt a return to the open ocean. They were trapped, forced to endure the barren wasteland until the weather calmed. As days turned into weeks, the men's spirits began to fray. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and thirst parched their throats. Even the strongest of them slowly withered away under the relentless sun. One evening, Brendan found an old, withered monk slumped against a boulder, staring out at the endless expanse of water. Are we truly abandoned by God? The old man croaked, his voice hoarse with despair. Do we face starvation and death on this cursed island, with not so much as a bird's feather to ease our pain? Brendan knelt beside the monk, offering him water from his canteen. God has not abandoned us, Brendan said firmly. He has merely challenged us to have faith in him. As long as we remain steadfast, he will guide us to safety. The old monk shook his head, his eyes filled with a lifetime of sorrows. Your youthful optimism will be your undoing, Brendan. You speak with the naivete of one who has never known want. I have seen too much suffering to cling to such foolish hope. Brendan rose to his feet, his gaze unwavering. Then let me show you that God still walks among us, even in this barren wasteland. He straightened his shoulders and raised his staff towards the heavens. In the name of God, I challenge the powers of darkness that hold us here. I demand that you release us from this island and return us safely to Ireland. A gust of wind swept across the island, carrying with it the scent of rain and the sound of thunder. Brendan stood firm, his faith unwavering, and then, as if in response to his prayer, a miracle occurred. The sky darkened and fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a torrent that soaked the parched earth. Relief flooded Brendan's features as he watched the rain. It was not just water that fell from the sky. It was a blessing from God Himself, a sign that their ordeal was nearing its end. But the old monk only shook his head sadly. "It is too late for me," he whispered, collapsing back against the boulder. "I have waited too long for God to deliver me. My body is weak, my spirit is broken. I fear I shall not see the shores of Ireland again." With a heavy heart, Brendan helped the old monk to his feet and led him to the shelter of some nearby caves. There they huddled together in the darkness as the storm raged around them, each lost in his own thoughts. For Brendan, the storm was a reminder of the trials that lay ahead. He knew that the true test of his faith was yet to come. When the storm had passed and the sun returned, the men found that their boat had been smashed to pieces by the waves. They were stranded, but before despair could take root, a miracle occurred. From a distance, they saw a ship approaching. Hope surged through their veins as they waved frantically to the sailors. The ship drew closer, and soon enough, strong arms pulled the weary travelers aboard. They were taken off the island and set foot on solid ground once more. But their ordeal was far from over. The ship had been captured by fierce warriors who dragged the men aboard as prisoners. One of the monks, unable to bear the thought of captivity, jumped into the sea and drowned himself. Another, driven mad by fear, bit off his own tongue and swallowed it, hoping to avoid the torment of torture and capture. A third simply closed his eyes and awaited his fate, muttering prayers under his breath. Brendan, however, refused to submit without a fight. He lunged at the nearest warrior, knocking him to the ground with a well-placed kick. The other monks followed his lead, surprising the attackers and giving them a taste of Irish resistance. The battle was fierce but short-lived. In the end, only 2 of the warriors remained standing, both badly beaten and ready to surrender. Brendan, his face streaked with dirt and blood, stood panting over the fallen, unsure of what to do next. But the sight of the approaching coastline gave him an idea. Leading the prisoners forward, he marched them toward the beach, forcing them to dig a deep trench. Then he ordered them to fill it with water. When the trench was full, Brendan led the remaining warriors to the edge of the trench and asked them to step forward and make a solemn oath. They agreed, and when they had pledged their word to leave Ireland in peace, Brendan released them, giving them food and drink before they departed. Brendan and his companions had endured many hardships on their journey to find the Blessed Isles, but none had shaken them quite like their encounter with the flesh-eaters. Brendan shuddered as he recalled the emaciated figures that had emerged from the forest, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of hunger and madness. They had descended upon the camp in the dead of night, stealing their food and killing their animals. By the time the sun rose, their provisions were gone, and several of their number were dead. Faced with the threat of starvation and attack, Brendan and his men had been forced to flee, abandoning their tents and most of their belongings. But as they ran for the safety of the hills, they had stumbled upon something that made them gasp in horror. It was an island unlike any they had ever seen before. Lush, green vegetation carpeted the land. Vibrant flowers grew in abundance, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of nectar. Crystal-clear streams meandered through the landscape, reflecting the light of the moon like 1,000 tiny mirrors. But what truly captured their attention was the sight that greeted them as they rounded a hill. Sprawled before them lay a vast field of human skulls, each one picked clean and grinning up at the sky. But there was something else there, too, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Dozens of emaciated figures lay scattered around the clearing, their bodies twisted and contorted as if in pain. Some were kneeling as though in prayer, while others were sprawled on their backs with their arms outstretched, frozen in a silent scream. Fear tightened its grip on Brendan's heart as he realized the terrible truth. These were not the remains of ordinary men, but of saints, holy men who had sought solace in the wilderness only to be murdered and left to rot by these cannibals. Shaking off his dread, Brendan rallied his companions, and they fled deeper into the island's heart, hoping to escape the clutches of the flesh-eaters. Now safe within the protective embrace of the forest, Brendan and his companions could finally relax. But their ordeal was far from over. They had survived the flesh-eaters, but the true challenge lay ahead. As they journeyed deeper into the island's heart, they soon realized that they were being watched. From their hiding places, the flesh-eaters observed their every move, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Every rustle of leaves sent shivers down their spines. Every snapped twig made them jump. But it wasn't just the fear of the flesh-eaters that haunted them. It was the knowledge that they were on sacred ground, the realization that they had stumbled into a place where the veil between the physical and spiritual realms was at its thinnest. Here, evil thrived, preying on the fears and weaknesses of those who dared to enter. Yet, despite the danger, Brendan and his companions, fueled by their unshakable faith, they knew that they were on a pilgrimage, not just to find the Blessed Isles, but to confront the darkness that lurked within themselves and the world. And so they journeyed deeper into the island's core, where the shadows were deepest and the temptations most dire, where they would be forced to confront the demons that had pursued them from the darkest recesses of their souls. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more tales of adventure and faith. Until next time, may the road rise to meet you, and may the wind always be at your back. Hi, it's me. Number 8. Possible New World. Did Brendan reach America? As Chapter 7 came to an end, we heard about the fertile, rich lands which are said to have been reached at the voyage's end. And now in this chapter, we're going to explore the various theories surrounding those mysterious islands. Let's begin with what we know or think we know from the text itself. When compiling this list of possible locations for these fertile lands, we will use only the clues that can be found within the prose of the voyage of Saint Brendan. We will not use any later written accounts, including those by Pseudo-Saxon Grammaticus, because they may contain anachronisms and misinformation. We will also refrain from adding any information that comes from archaeological findings or modern science, such as the existence of the Vinland map, for example, because none of that existed in the 9th century. Remember, we're trying to see if the Brendan could have reached the Americas in the 8th century, not later. This is what we know from the text alone. The description of the island is quite brief. It states that after sailing past the eastern limit of the known world, Brendan and his followers landed on an island inhabited by birds that made no noise. They found it uninhabited apart from the birds until they reached a lake on the island's shore, where they saw 2 men fishing. These men were hairy, ugly, short of stature, had long white beards down to their waists, and wore only leather breeches. They did not understand the language of the Irish monks, but the monks understood theirs, which sounded like Gaelic. This was the first human contact the Irish monks had on the island. Later, Brendan and 4 companions landed further along the same coastline and went exploring. They walked all day across the island's length and never found another human being. That tells us that the population must have lived only on the shores of the island, probably around the lake where the fish were plentiful. He noticed many sheep on the island and later hunted some for food. These sheep had never seen humans before and were very tame. The sheep were black and white, fat and large. There were also many other wild animals there, but he didn't mention what kind. He then describes how the next day, when they awoke, a great wind began to rise. So they knew it was time to leave because they had learned the previous evening from the two fishermen that a violent wind arose every evening at the same time, which would make their boat a wreck if caught in it. As they were sailing away, they watched the island recede into the distance, and they never saw it again. Now, let's take a look at 3 possible locations, starting with the most popular theory, which places the fertile lands at the Azores or Canary Islands. The Azores and Canary Islands are located off the northwest coast of Africa and were known to the Irish monks due to previous explorers and traders visiting them. In fact, one of the most popular theories suggests that Brendan may have visited the Canary Islands several times. According to this theory, the western limit of the known world mentioned in the text refers to the Strait of Gibraltar, and the fertile lands would be the Canaries or the Azores. These islands are known to have been inhabited by people with red hair and fair skin, which could explain the description of the 2 men Brendan met fishing as hairy, ugly, and short of stature. However, this theory has its weaknesses. Although the Azores and Canary Islands were known to the Irish monks, they were also well known to be inhabited by people, the Berbers. And there's no way they would have been uninhabited when Brendan arrived. Furthermore, if the western limit of the known world does indeed refer to the Strait of Gibraltar, it does seem likely that Brendan would have been able to travel far enough west to reach either of these island chains without having sailed further north into the Atlantic Ocean. Finally, the sheep described by Brendan do unmatch any native sheep species found on either the Azores or Canary Islands. But this theory isn't completely dead yet. Perhaps the islands were uninhabited during Brendan's visit due to some temporary event, such as war or famine. Or maybe the sheep he encountered were domesticated animals left behind by previous visitors. But what about the sheep? Okay, second theory, Iceland or Greenland. The description of the fertile lands in the Voyage of St. Brendan shares many similarities with descriptions of Iceland and Greenland. The western limit of the known world could refer to the most western point of these islands, and the fertile lands would be Iceland or Greenland. The description of the 2 men that Brendan met fishing could be seen as matching the description of the Icelandic and Greenlandic people at the time. Both Iceland and Greenland were known to the Irish monks, and monks from both places had visited Ireland in the early 8th century. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that Greenland was settled by Irish monks before it was settled by Vikings. Another piece of evidence pointing towards this theory is the sheep. An early Irish saint, Saint Patrick, is said to have brought sheep to Ireland from Britain, and those sheep eventually became the ancestors to all modern Irish sheep breeds. So it's plausible that similar sheep could have been found in Iceland and Greenland. Given that the Vikings who settled these islands also brought domestic animals with them from Europe. Furthermore, the sheep described by Brendan could very well have been the ancestors to the Icelandic and Greenlandic sheep breeds we know today. However, there are some problems with this theory. If we assume that the western limit of the known world is the most western point of Iceland or Greenland, it would mean that Brendan's journey took him much further than the Irish monks would have thought possible. In fact, it would place the location of the fertile lands closer to North America than to Europe. Also, while it's true that the Irish monks knew about the existence of these islands, they didn't know that they were inhabited by people. So, if Brendan had actually landed in Iceland or Greenland, he would have encountered more than just sheep. Okay, third theory, Newfoundland or North America itself. Now we come to the theory that places the fertile lands at Newfoundland or even the mainland of North America. This is by far the most controversial theory and the least likely of the three options. Proponents of this theory argue that the description of the fertile lands and its inhabitants fits well with the landscape and the indigenous people of Newfoundland. They also argue that the Vinland map, which dates back to the 15th century, but depicts cartographic knowledge from the 9th century, clearly shows a landmass that could be North America. And perhaps even more compelling is the fact that the Basque whalers, who were known to have explored the Grand Banks of Newfoundland in the 8th and 9th centuries, may have been the ones to introduce sheep to the island. The main problem with this theory is that there is no direct evidence to support it. While it's true that the Basque people did visit Newfoundland and that sheep have been found in Newfoundland dating back to the 9th century, there is no way to prove that the sheep were brought there by the Basque, or that the Irish monks ever knew that these islands existed. Another problem with this theory is that it requires us to assume that Brendan and his followers traveled much further than the Irish monks would have thought possible. But if they did travel that far, why didn't they sail even further and claim to have reached the mainland of a new continent? Maybe because they didn't realize they had reached a new continent. Back in the 8th and 9th centuries, the Irish monks knew that the earth was round, but they didn't realize how big it was. They probably thought that Asia and Africa were connected at the eastern tip of the Mediterranean Sea. Therefore, when they reached the western limit of the known world, they assumed that the land they found must be part of Asia, even though it wasn't. All right, so we've calmly weighed the three possible locations for the mysterious fertile lands mentioned in the text. Now, let's calmly weigh the evidence for each theory. The Azores, or Canary Islands, seem to be the most likely candidate. But there are some problems with this theory. The sheep described by Brendan do unmatch any native sheep species found on either the Azores or Canary Islands. Nor do we have evidence that these islands were uninhabited in the 8th century. Iceland or Greenland could possibly explain the sheep, but it would mean that Brendan traveled further than the Irish monks thought possible. Newfoundland or North America is the least likely option, but it's still possible, especially if we consider the sheep, the Vinland map, and the Basque whalers. Unfortunately, there is no clear evidence to support any of these theories. It's entirely possible that the fertile lands may have been an entirely different place that is unknown to us. So what do you think? Do you believe that Brendan reached the Americas in the 8th century? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And remember to stay tuned for new episodes. Until then, may the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. Until we meet again. So, after Brendan had lived in exile for 17 years, he finally returned home to Ireland in the year 558. A great crowd gathered to greet him at the port, including his former pupil, Saint Colman, who would later become the Bishop of Derry. And after so many years away, it was good to be home. But it wasn't long before Brendan left again, this time to take up the position of abbot in the monastery of Clonfert in County Offaly. It's here that we see a slight discrepancy in the historical records with regard to Brendan's life story. See, according to one account, he stayed at Clonfert for 25 years, living out the remainder of his days there in peace. But according to another account, Brendan didn't stay at Clonfert for nearly that long. Instead, he left Ireland once again just 3 years later in 561 AD to go on a pilgrimage to Rome. But regardless of which account is closer to the truth, or perhaps they are both correct in their own ways, what we know for sure is that Brendan eventually did return home to Ireland for good in the year 577 A. And while he may have died in Clonfert between then and 590 AD, no one knows exactly when that happened. So all we can say for certain is that he died sometime during those last 13 years of his life. As an abbot and teacher, Brendan was highly respected, and he spent his time writing and training other monks. In fact, one of his students, a monk by the name of Kieran, Q, would go on to found his own monastery at the nearby townland of Clonmacnoise, just across the River Shannon. And so it seems that Brendan was fairly successful in establishing a sort of mini monastic network in the region. But sadly, not everyone was happy for him. According to the annals of the Four Masters, in the year 590 AD, Brendan was killed by a rival named Colman, who was also an abbot. Now, Colman ruled over the monastery of Killedy, not too far away from Clonfert, and apparently the two had been feuding over some land dispute. And so, Colman must have finally snapped, because he went to Brendan's monastery at Clonfort and killed him there. But luckily for Brendan's reputation, his body was quickly brought back to his original monastery at Birr, where he was venerated as a saint and a martyr. But even though Brendan's physical body died over 1400 years ago, his legend certainly has not. Because if you ask any Irish person about him today, they will probably tell you that he is most famous for something that happened much earlier in his life. You see, Brendan's voyage to the mysterious land of the blessed is probably one of the most well-known stories in Irish. But since it was first written down around 1,000 years after it supposedly took place, if it even happened at all, it's impossible to separate fact from fiction. So, let me just remind you that none of these events have been proven to be true with 100% certainty. What little evidence we do have suggests that Brendan did travel extensively throughout the British Isles and Western Europe. But any details beyond that are anyone's guess. However, that doesn't mean his voyage wasn't real, simply because it hasn't been proven to be real. After all, we don't have any hard evidence proving that Jesus walked on water. Yet, we still accept that event as being true. But anyway, what's fascinating about Brendan's voyage is that even though the exact details of it vary depending on which version of the tale you read, there are always some consistent elements that remain unchanged. For example, every single account agrees that Brendan's journey began at the harbor of Ernagor, which is believed to be the same as the modern-day harbor of Reynard Point in County Kerry. Also, in every telling, Brendan and his companions traveled west and eventually came upon an island inhabited by monks. They weren't dangerous, but they were scary-looking. And in order to defend themselves against potential threats, the monks of this island carried shields and spears. In one version of the tale, Brendan and his men come across a giant bird that tries to eat them all, but the bird is scared off when one of Brendan's companions, Brother Benignus, blesses himself in the name of Jesus Christ. In another telling, Brendan encounters a man with 7 heads, and in another, he meets a woman with 7 mouths. But in every version, there is also an underwater city called High Brazil, inhabited by beautiful women. And it's said that whoever sees these women is granted the wish of his heart. Though these women appear to be nothing more than mortals, there is something inherently dangerous about them. You see, in several versions of the tale, the men who see these women fall in love with them and decide to stay behind in the underwater city. But the moment they do, they are immediately transformed into seals and pulled under the waves forever. And although these mythical creatures seem to play a very important role in the story, the main character, Saint Brendan, does not engage with them in any way. He remains pure of heart and innocent of sin. In fact, he's even described as having a special purity about him, which is said to be similar to the purity of the Virgin Mary. And when Brendan reaches the end of his journey and finally returns home to Ireland, he brings with him a branch from the tree of life, which grows only in the Garden of Eden. This is supposedly the same tree that Adam and Eve ate from when they were tempted by the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And so, the branch that Brendan brings back with him becomes a symbol of temptation and sin, as well as a reminder of the original sin of humanity. Now, the temptation to stray from the path of righteousness is also symbolized by the island that Brendan visits on his journey, because it represents everything he could ever want or need, but he cannot stay there. He must continue on his spiritual journey, and he does so without succumbing to any temptation. And therefore, he is rewarded for his steadfast commitment to God. That's why St. Brendan's Voyage has become such a powerful metaphor for the struggles of the human soul. It is a story about temptation and perseverance, about faith and doubt, about hope and despair. It's a story about the darkness that exists within us all, and the light that shines through those who overcome it. But unfortunately, over the past 1400 years or so, the details of Brendan's voyage have become muddied by folklore and embellishments, and separating the truth from the fiction is almost impossible. For example, we don't know if Brendan actually landed in the Shetland Islands. Most likely, he never made it that far north, because the climate in the 6th century was much colder than it is now. And those islands would have been basically uninhabitable for a bunch of Irish monks. Or perhaps he landed in the Azores. But most scholars agree that Hy Brasil is a mythical underwater kingdom that lies somewhere off the coast of Ireland. The problem is no one can agree on exactly where that is. There have been numerous attempts to map the route of Brendan's voyage, but none of them have ever been accepted as fact. What's most intriguing is how many people believe that Hy Brasil really did exist. One of the earliest accounts of the voyage claims that Brendan and his crew landed there in the year 523 AD. But a later retelling places the journey as occurring in the year 709 AD. There are even maps showing the supposed location of Hy Brasil. But these maps were created hundreds of years after the voyage allegedly took place. And so, the conclusion most historians have come to is that Hy Brasil is a blend of fact, faith, and folklore. Perhaps there really was an island that lay off the coast of Ireland, but over time, the legends of this place grew until it eventually became something completely fantastical. Or maybe it was always purely imaginary. But the fact of the matter is, the story of Brendan's voyage has captured the imaginations of people throughout the centuries. It's a tale as old as time itself, a story of adventure and discovery, of faith and doubt, of temptation and redemption. No matter what the skeptics may say, there is something undeniably powerful about the story of Saint Brendan and his journey to the land of the blessed. The first maps of what would come to be known as the North American continent were made by medieval cartographers in Europe, based on a single manuscript telling the story of Saint Brendan the Navigator. This is chapter 10 of a series about the legend of Brendan the Navigator. Let's talk about some very old books. We're going to look at some of the oldest surviving copies of the story of Navigatio Sancti Brendani, which was written around 1070 in Ireland. And we'll see how this text inspired some of the very earliest maps of the lands that would become known as the Americas. Our story begins in the Irish Sea, specifically with the island of Man, a small mountainous island between Ireland and England. It was here in the late 1060s that a monk named John performed a miracle. A nearby church had been struck by lightning and split in two. But while the congregation fled in terror, young John stood his ground. After the bolt of lightning passed through the building, he walked over to it and planted his staff into the ground where it had fallen. And lo, the staff took root and grew into an oak tree, symbolizing life springing from death. Soon, news of this miracle spread across Ireland, and pilgrims flocked to the site to witness it for themselves. But then the Vikings attacked and destroyed the church and killed John. Miraculously, however, the oak sapling survived. And so, people started saying that if you took the sapling back to the original site of John's martyrdom, it would grow into a full-grown tree, bearing fruit and nuts in a single day. Naturally, people went back to do this, but they didn't have time to wait around for the tree to bear fruit. So they chopped it down, only for it to spring back up even stronger than before. Now, word got around that this was a magical tree which had been granted special powers by God Himself. In fact, it was said that the tree was so strong that nothing could kill it, not fire, not sword, not flood, not even poison. And so, people started going there to test their weapons on it, only to find them rendered useless against the magical wood. Over the years, the tree became a popular destination for European Christians to visit, especially since it was located near a monastery, where monks transcribed manuscripts, meaning literate visitors could get their weapons tested and also have their books copied while they waited. And it was at one of these monasteries that a scribe named Cormac G. Dougie translated the Navigatio Sancti Brendani from Latin into Old Irish. This is our earliest surviving copy. Dating back to around 1070 AD, it's held at the National Library of Wales and is known as the Book of Leinster. Our next surviving copy is much later and is also a translation into another language. It's the Histoire de Saint Brendan, which is a French version dating back to around 1135, which was copied in Brittany, which is in northwest France. It was originally thought that this might have been the very first version of the text ever written. But now, scholars know that it was actually translated from the earlier Irish version found in the Book of Leinster. Now, you may be thinking, okay, cool, but those are just translations. Where is the original? Well, the thing is, we don't have it. See, the original version was written in Latin, and we think it was probably written around 50 years before the two copies we have, meaning it was likely written in the mid-10th century. Unfortunately, the original is lost. However, there are clues within the texts that tell us about its contents. For example, in the Histoire de Saint Brendan, the author says that his source was a book written in the Irish language. He also says that he translated the work from Irish into French because many French lords wanted to hear about the miracles of Saint Brendan. This tells us that the Latin original was written in Ireland, most likely at the scriptorium of the monastery of Clonmacnoise, since that was where Cormac compiled the Book of Leinster. But perhaps even more interesting is that the author of the Histoire de Saint Brendan says that his sources were on just the Irish monks writing at Clonmacnoise, but that he also interviewed a man who claimed to be descended from one of Brendan's own crew members. Of course, by the time the Histoire de Saint Brendan was written in the mid-12th century, Brendan's voyage would have been at least 3 centuries old. So the chances of interviewing a direct descendant of one of Brendan's crew would have been pretty slim. Therefore, safe to assume that the original Latin version written in the 90s was still relatively recent in the minds of the Irish people. As we can see, the early medieval period was a time when stories like Brendan's were copied and recopied as scribes translated them into different languages for different audiences. What makes this significant is that throughout all of these translations, one of the key details about Brendan's voyage never changed. No matter where he traveled, whether it be to Ireland, France, England, Germany, or Italy, whenever someone wrote down the story of Brendan's voyage, they included this detail: that after leaving Ireland, the first land he came across was an island filled with wonderful animals. The Irish called it Innis Catha, meaning the island of cats, but the Welsh called it Innis Witrin, meaning the island of white horses, and the French called it Ostravent, meaning land of promise. This detail did unmake it into the earliest surviving copy of the Navigatio Sancti Brendani that we have, but every other version has it. And it is important to remember that the people who added this detail lived centuries before Christopher Columbus ever set foot in the Americas. So obviously, They weren't talking about any real islands that he discovered. Rather, they were using their imaginations and creating fantastical lands beyond the sea. In fact, in the Histoire de Saint Brendan, the author even says so. He writes, "We sailed out to seek the land of promise, and we found it beyond the sunset towards the north, in which blessed Brendan had sailed in former times." Now, when we look at medieval maps, we often see lands of legend like the one described by the author of the Histoire de Saint Brendan. These are often called bycatch islands, meaning they were drawn onto maps not because mapmakers believed they actually existed, but rather because they wanted to depict the world according to written accounts like the Navigator Sancti Brendani, a mythical island off the west coast of Africa that appears on 15th century Portuguese maps, or Antilia, a supposed archipelago near Iceland that appears on 13th and 14th century Catalan and German maps. Even the famous 15th century map by Pierre Race includes Antilia. You can see it right here. There's one other bycatch island that you should know about. However, because it played a pivotal role in shaping our modern understanding of history, it's called Thule, and it appears on this map by Richard of Hempel dating back to around 1250. It's huge, taking up nearly half the entire Atlantic Ocean. That's because people believed it was located where the sun went to rest every night. Now, for centuries, people debated exactly where Thule was located. Some thought it was in the Arctic, while others thought it was somewhere near Ireland. But one thing everyone agreed on was that it was an island. And the biggest proponent of this idea was a man named Guy d'Oz. He was a secretary to Pope Innocent IV and the author of a widely read travel book called The Secretorum, or The Secrets. And in it, he writes that beyond the sunset, past the island of Ireland and the British Isles, you will find the island of Thule, and in the middle of the island there is a monastery of holy men. So, in 1298, two English friars decided to sail west from England to find the island of Thule. They crossed the Channel and headed toward Ireland, expecting to find the island just beyond the coast. But after traveling for a week, they saw no sign of it, and so they turned back. And this, my friends, is the earliest recorded instance of European explorers sailing west in search of new lands. Now, it wasn't until almost 250 years later that Christopher Columbus finally reached the Americas. But that doesn't mean nothing happened in between. Many explorers braved the dangers of the open ocean and charted the previously unknown waters of the North Atlantic. And all of them were motivated by a desire to discover new lands and bring Christianity to the heathens living there. But why did they believe they would find new lands. Well, they believed it because they read about it in books like the Navigatio Sancti Brendani. And when we examine the maps they produced, we can see evidence of that. Let me show you. Here's a map by Pierre Daly, who was a cardinal and bishop. It dates back to around 1360, and it's one of the best examples of a map showing the influence of the Navigatio Sancti Brendani. You can see the island of Thule in the middle of the Atlantic, and surrounding it is a large sea monster, which is a reference to the whirlpool that Brendan and his crew encountered in the story. Also, check out how the coastline of Ireland ends abruptly at the top. This is because the author of the Astuar, the Saint Brendan, said that Brendan left Ireland and sailed straight into the sunset, and so everyone assumed that Ireland ended right there. This is even more apparent on this map. My Nicholas was a cardinal and bishop. It dates back to 1440, and it shows the island of Thule in the exact same spot as Daly's map. In fact, there were literally hundreds of medieval maps showing this exact same thing. The island of Thule in the middle of the Atlantic. However, eventually the trend began to fade away as new discoveries were made and more accurate maps were produced. By the 16th century, this is something you wouldn't see anymore. But it was a very real trend during the late medieval period, and it was fueled by one book, the Navigatio Sancti Brendani. What's fascinating is that this book was written long before the Americas were actually discovered. Yet it helped inspire the age of discovery. I guess that makes Brendan kind of like an old Norse Christopher Columbus. Except, unlike Columbus, Brendan never actually set foot in the New World. His voyages only ever took him to the mythical lands of his own imagination. And that's really what I want you to take away from this video. When we study the legend of Saint Brendan, we can't interpret everything literally. Sure, there may have been an Irish monk named Brendan who sailed west from Ireland, but his adventures were rooted in symbolism. Just like the author of the Astuar, de Saint Brendan said, he was searching for the land of promise, and by doing so, he was searching for paradise. Brendan's voyage isn't just about geography, it's about the human desire to find a better world. And that's something we can all relate to, no matter where we live. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the series on a crowdfunding platform. The link is in the description below. As always, a huge thank you to my supporters. Your generosity truly means the world to me and allows me to keep bringing these videos to everyone for free. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Chapter 11: Modern Explorations. Testing the Legend. The year is 1976. A team of modern explorers, led by German yachtsman Tim Severin, had just completed an incredible journey across the Atlantic Ocean in a 7-meter-long leather boat. The boat was modeled after a design that may have been used by monks over 1,500 years ago. Their route mirrored that of Brendan's voyage, traveling west from Ireland to North America. But instead of landing in Newfoundland, their destination was the island of Hell's Kitchen off the coast of Maine. They chose this spot because it was close to the supposed location of Brendan's journey. But upon arriving there, they found no trace of his settlement. After 6 weeks at sea, their boat, which had sprung many leaks, was finally beginning to fall apart. With their supplies dwindling, they knew that if they didn't find land soon, they would die. So they decided to push on, hoping to reach the coast of Maine or the nearby bay of Fundy. Luckily for them, they were eventually spotted, and a police boat offered them water and food. After almost drowning, they were finally taken off the boat, and the journey was over. This crazy adventure proved that what Brendan supposedly did 15 centuries earlier was actually possible. For most people, though, this should have been the end of the story. There was now proof that Brendan could have made the journey and maybe even established a settlement in North America. But many still refused to believe in Brendan's voyage. Why? Well, mostly because of one tiny problem. We have no written accounts of Brendan setting foot in North America, making this trip, or founding a monastery. All we have is a hagiography, a book that clearly describes him as a real saint who performed miracles. Now, those who doubt Brendan's voyage often use this lack of evidence as proof that he never traveled to North America. This makes no sense whatsoever. St. Patrick's hagiography also labels him as a real saint who performed miracles. Yet, nobody doubts that he went to Ireland and spread Christianity there. Just think about it. If somebody wrote down everything that Brendan supposedly did, including traveling to Ireland, performing miracles there, then writing down everything that he supposedly did in North America, including founding a monastery and traveling back to Ireland, then we would have 2 separate accounts of the same man doing 2 separate things in 2 different places. And like I said, if we have one account of him doing something, do we really think that we would have 2 accounts of him doing something else, entirely somewhere else? That makes even less sense. It's far more likely that he did both things than that he did neither. So this leaves us with 3 options. 1. The author of the hagiography was lying about everything, including Brendan going to Ireland. 2. The author of the hagiography was lying about everything except Brendan going to Ireland. Or 3. The author of the hagiography was telling the truth about everything. Yet the anti-Brendan crowd chooses to only consider option number 1. There are so many other things that prove that this journey was indeed possible. In 1497, John Cabot sailed from Bristol. England to Newfoundland, Canada, where he landed near Cape Bonavista. He was hired by an Italian merchant named Sebastian Munster to explore the northern Atlantic. Upon reaching Newfoundland, Cabot left behind a small group of men while he returned to Europe to tell everybody about his discovery. According to some sources, this group of men stayed there for quite a while, learning about the native plants and animals before returning to Europe themselves. This suggests that not only could Europeans survive in North America, but they could even thrive there. The question is, how did these men survive? Well, according to one source, they lived on fish, fruit, animal skins, and most likely, grapes. Grapes. Yeah, it turns out that grapes grow wild in Newfoundland. A grape species called Vitis riparia grows naturally in eastern Canada and the northeast of the United States. These grapes can be made into wine, which was exactly what the group of men did. Here's an excerpt from a letter written by one of the men named Gaspar Court Real, who was a pilot on Cabot's voyage. It reads, "We found there a great quantity of grapes as large as those of Spain, and we made wine of them, and the land is very good." Another source claims that the men built wooden huts to live in, which is further proof that the climate wasn't too bad. If it was freezing cold, they probably wouldn't have bothered with huts made out of wood. Instead, they would have preferred to return home immediately. So we know that grapes grew in Newfoundland, and that it was warm enough for Europeans to survive there without shelter. But what about the boats? Could Brendan and his men have crossed the Atlantic in leather boats? Well, the answer is yes, as proven by Tim Severin's journey in the 1970s. But why do so many people refuse to accept this evidence? One reason might be simply because they don't want to admit they were wrong. You see, the idea that Europeans discovered America first has become quite popular in recent times. Even though it's completely false, many people still choose to believe it. I mean, just think about it. If we're all wrong about this, if Brendan and his men really did make it to North America first, then everything changes. If they were the first Europeans to make it to North America, then it was them who discovered it, not Christopher Columbus. And if they were the ones who founded the first European settlement in North America, then that means that North America was the first place outside of Europe to have a European settlement. It was the first place to have a church and a Christian community. And it was certainly the first place to have a monastery. In fact, if the journey of Brendan is true, then the history of Christianity changes completely. The first Christians outside of the Roman Empire weren't Spanish or Portuguese. Instead, it was Irish monks who brought Christianity to North America 500 years before any other Europeans did. And who knows what else they accomplished while they were there. Maybe they had hospitals or universities or even public schools. Maybe they established the first paper mill in the New World, or the first printing press. Maybe they invented new technologies or agricultural methods. The possibilities are really endless. What's certain, though, is that if the journey of Brendan is true, then the Irish played a crucial role in the early days of European exploration. If they were willing to travel so far across the ocean, then who knows where else they explored? Did they travel to Asia? Did they travel to Africa? Did they travel to Australia? What if they were the ones who discovered India instead of Vasco da Gama? It seems as though many people simply cannot accept the idea that the Irish would have been so advanced. To be fair, it was NT until recently that we even had proof that such a journey was possible in the first place. Once we learned that it was possible, though, we had to reevaluate everything we thought we knew about the early days of exploration. Think about it. Before Tim Severn's journey, we all assumed that the first Europeans to reach North America were the Vikings at Lang So Meadows around the year 1000 AD, and then nothing happened again until John Cabot in 1497. So that asks a gap of 500 years between the Vikings and John Cabot. But if the Irish were the ones who settled in Newfoundland around the year 550, then this means that they stayed there for another 950 years until the year 1500. This tells us that we have been looking at European exploration all wrong. It could be that the Irish were the most important explorers of all. They could be the reason why Europeans eventually began exploring the world once again after the Vikings stopped. Maybe the Irish monks of Newfoundland even inspired John Cabot and other explorers to venture across the ocean. For centuries, the journey of Brendan was seen as nothing more than a legend. Many dismissed it as a fairy tale or a myth. However, over time, renewed interest in the story has sparked debates about its historical accuracy and the potential impact of Brendan's voyages on the course of history. In recent years, the story of Brendan has captivated the imagination of scholars and adventurers alike. There has been a surge in research and expeditions aimed at uncovering the truth behind the legend. Some scholars argue that the voyage described in the text is a historical event that has been embellished through storytelling over the centuries. Others believe that it is a complete fabrication, a medieval fantasy that has no basis in reality. Despite the ongoing debate, the story of Brendan continues to inspire wonder and curiosity. As we delve deeper into the mysteries of the past, we may never know for sure whether Brendan and his companions really set foot in North America. However, the legend lives on, reminding us of the incredible spirit of exploration that has driven humanity throughout history. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. We've reached the end of our tale. It's time for one final look at Chapter 12. And this is a story that needs no summary, because it's right there in the title. This is Brendan's gentle legacy. And Brendan's journey, if it was indeed all a dream, has been one of the greatest ones we've ever seen. Full of so much mystery and wonder and even terror and torment. And if it wasn't just a dream, then Brendan's journey becomes even greater. An epic adventure across the ocean, filled with encounters of the most wondrous kind, mythical beasts, fantastic lands, otherworldly people. Now, as we close our tale, I want to offer a thought. Whether this story is myth or truth, whether Brendan really did sail beyond the sunset or not, I think the story of Brendan, the voyage of Brendan, tells us something profound. So, let me remind you now of the opening lines of this very tale. In the beginning was the journey, the end before the beginning. The desire of the heart that will not be denied, though all the world oppose. That may be a quote from some long-lost scroll from the days of old, but it could also be from a letter written by a father to his son, or a lover to her beloved, or from the journal of a man who discovered too late in life what he was meant to do. For the desire of the heart will not be denied, though all the world oppose. That is the theme of this tale, the theme of this great chapter, and the theme of Brendan's entire voyage. For Brendan was not merely a man who wished to explore the edges of the world. He was a man who refused to accept the limitations of his world. Brendan was not merely a sailor or an explorer or a cartographer. Brendan was a man who sailed because he had to, because his heart would not be denied, even though the whole world opposed him. He sailed because he believed in something beyond his world. And if the world opposes you, then you must go forth anyway, for you have the strength inside of you that you need to make your journey. You only have to discover it. If you believe in something beyond the world you see, then you can find it. Because you have the strength inside you that you need to make your journey. Brendan found that strength in his faith. And for those who believe in God, who put their faith in something greater than themselves, such strength will always be available. But what if you don't know if you have faith? What if you're afraid that if you sail into the unknown, you'll never find your way back home? Well, then you must trust in yourself, in your own strength, in your own courage. For within you, Brendan knew that there was something greater than fear, something more important than safety. Within him was curiosity, a desire for knowledge, a desire for discovery. Within him was the spirit of exploration and the spirit of discovery, which is part all of us. When Brendan set sail, he knew he might never return, that he might never see his home again. But still he went, because he felt there was something worth seeing out there, beyond the waves, past the horizon. When Brendan arrived at the edge of the known world when he looked out into the darkness and saw nothing but water and mist and the promise of what might lie. Ahead still, he went forward because he had to. And when the horrors of the deep rose up against him and threatened to drag him down into the watery grave, still he fought, still he struggled, still he hoped, and in the end he survived. And so can we, because within us is the same strength that was in Brendan, the same courage, the same determination. If the world opposes you, if you feel that the world is against you, then go forth anyway. Because you have the strength inside of you that you need to make your journey. If you believe in something beyond the world you see, then you can find it, because you have the strength inside you that you need to make your journey. Brendan found that strength in his faith. And for those who believe in God, who put their faith in something greater than themselves, such strength will always be available. And yet Brendan is not just a symbol of faith, but of exploration and imagination as well. There are those who say that Brendan never really left Ireland. They say that Brendan's entire voyage took place in a dream or in a vision. And if that is true, then Brendan is a symbol of how the human mind can take us anywhere, how our dreams can carry us beyond the limits of our waking lives. The world that Brendan dreamed of, or imagined, or saw in a vision is a world of mystery and wonder, a world full of beauty and terror and strange creatures and magical lands. But it is also a world full of kindness and compassion and generosity. In Brendan's world, he finds friends and helpers and guides. He meets people who are different from him, but who are nonetheless kind and welcoming. This is a world of magic and myth, yes, but it is also a world of possibility and potential. A world where anything can happen, a world where anything is possible. This is the world that Brendan brings back with him when he returns home. A world that inspires awe and wonder in those who hear his tales. Brendan's world is a world that reminds us that there is so much more to life than what we see around us every day. That there is so much more to the world than meets the eye. Brendan's world is a world that calls us to explore and discover, to dream and imagine, to believe in the impossible. So, as we bring our tale to a close, let us remember Brendan not just as a sailor or an explorer, but as a symbol of the power of the human spirit, the power of imagination, the power of belief, the power of hope. Let us remember Brendan as a man who dared to go beyond the limits of his world, and in doing so, discovered something truly remarkable, the boundless possibilities of the human soul. Perhaps Brendan's journey was a dream. Perhaps it was a vision. Perhaps it was a myth. But whether it was myth or truth, it matters not, for Brendan's legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of those who hear his tale, inspiring them to explore the world around them and the world within them, to dream big dreams and to believe in the impossible. Perhaps Brendan never really left Ireland. Perhaps Brendan's entire voyage took place in a dream or in a vision. And if that is true, then Brendan is a symbol of how the human mind can take us anywhere. Dreams can carry us beyond the limits of our waking lives. So let us close our tale of Brendan with a final thought. Whether Brendan's journey was real or imagined, it matters not, for the journey is the important thing, not the destination. It is not where we go that matters, but what we discover along the way, not only in the world around us, but in ourselves. Brendan's journey was a journey of self-discovery, a journey of the soul. It was a journey that transformed him forever, and in doing so, transformed the world around him. So let us follow in Brendan's footsteps and go on our own journeys, not just of the body, but of the mind and spirit as well. Let us explore the world around us and the world within us, and discover all that we can be and all that we can do. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May you find your own Brendan's gentle legacy within you. May you find the courage, the curiosity, the determination, the kindness, the compassion, the generosity of spirit that made Brendan's journey possible. May you find these things within you, and may they guide you on your own journeys, whatever they may be. Go now in peace. Rest well. Sleep well. Dream your own dreams, and may they carry you to places of wonder and beauty and mystery. And may they remind you always of the boundless possibilities of the human soul. Go now in peace.